Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's roundtable, our pharma supply chain serialization and traceability with TigerGraph. Before we get started, just wanted to go over a few items with you all. There will be time at the end of the webinar for Q&A, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom meeting, or you can chat with the panelists. We are recording today's session, and I will be sending up a follow-up email this week with the recording. And if you have any questions or issues during the webinar, please feel free to message me, the host, Expero Internal. I'll be happy to help you out. We hope you enjoy today's presentation hosted by Expero and TigerGraph. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn the meeting over to our group of panelists.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Michael Shaler. I'm from TigerGraph. I run our partnerships, and I'm so delighted that we work so well with our partners at Expero. We have Chris LaCava, who's the head of product at Expero. We have Victor Lee, who's head of product strategy for TigerGraph. And then we have Brian Thompson, who leads Expero Ventures. We're going to be talking today about supply chain in depth, and we wanted to address some of that right up front. Next slide, please. We're going to walk through the supply chain challenges, why the change, why now. We're going to talk. Brian Thompson is going to talk about serialization and traceability. Chris is going to give a demo, talk about the art of the possible, and then Victor is going to talk about how to build a better supply chain TigerGraph. We'll wrap up at the end with a Q&A of 5 minutes, and we're very pleased and grateful that you've joined us today. So thank you so much for that. With that, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The pandemic has caused supply chains to be stressed in ways that we just have never before. E-commerce is up $41 billion. 8 weeks of change that took previously. And so what we're seeing is a complete, when people talk about digital transformation, much of what they're talking about is how supply chains work in terms of going from the C level to the manufacturing quality, logistics, channels, and sales, and customer support. That entire value chain has been completely upended and transformed by the pandemic. And so what we're seeing, from our customers and prospects is that there's two key themes for 2021, and we're already starting to see some of this in action. We're seeing resistance capacity, being able to deal with the shocks and the expansion of supply chain requirements, and then the recovery capacity. I'm about to get my second Pfizer shot in 2 weeks, and I'm so excited because that really makes a difference for me personally in terms of how I can think about working with our customers on their supply chain requirements. And so what we end up with, we talk about serializability and then visibility, but we can see, connect, and act based on what we're on graph-enabled supply chain digital twins, real-time flows, and then real-time graph analytics insights are really going to change this. And Chris is going to show us what that looks like. Brian will talk about that further as well. Click. Next slide, please. And obviously, I mentioned passing, Pfizer, the vaccine is changing things, how we're working. And kind of how we can look forward to changing. And so, watching the delivery of vaccines and kind of how that has been such an interesting journey all its own, from development to delivery has been extraordinary. And so we're so excited to see this transform. Click, next slide. So again, just to reiterate, we want to make sure that we can help customers design the right architecture and pipelines. We want to connect and therefore pick the right methodologies, and then act and be flexible and plan for growth. Click. So here's how we think about kind of building the map to success between TigerGraph and Expero, and how we work together. So we start with a broad range of data sources, existing ERP systems, existing supply chain management systems, and all the parts catalogs, all the relationships between parts and components, assemblies and components, supply contracts, engineering features. All of that gets plugged into an enriched supply chain graph. And that means that then we can enrich the graph with other metadata about the supply chain. And this is where the digital twin component really starts to be very powerful. Cost factors, risk factors, constraints. And then what that enables us to do, step 3, is, we have, human exploratory learning where you can actually see what's going on, but then unsupervised learning, this is where machine learning and deep and cycle returning learning is very, very powerful. That teaches us about things like anomalies and how to respond to them, how to intercept cyclical failures, how to understand frequent patterns. And then over time, what that means that we can do with that machine learning aspect is to use graph analytics plus machine learning to optimize operations and decisions. We can extract features, we can gather training data, and then we can train the models with graph data as well. So so we see a full life cycle of how a graph can transform digital supply chains or supply chains and their digital twins. Click. So Gartner has been remarkable in their focus on graph analytics. They have had like 4 or 5 big pieces on graph databases and graph analytics lately. They're highlighting this as a top technology trend for 2020 and 2021. And in order to see what your supply chain is doing, you need to be able to ask business logic questions of their data. Visibility increases the insights into it. One of our customers who's speaking at Graph Plus AI Summit next month is a guy named Harry Powell, and Harry runs analytics at Jaguar Land Rover. And he made the point that we're finally able to ask questions of our data for the first time in 25 years because we have the technology to enable insights into connected data. So we can blend data from multiple sources, multiple business units, and even more from external data. And then that means we can take action. Better analytics means better inquiries and better, more effective business outcomes. So we see the value of what insights can do for driving digital twin outcomes with supply chain. Click. So about TigerGraph is a leader, according to Forrester, for graph data platforms. We're the only scalable graph database for the enterprise. We're cloud first, and we can deploy anywhere, on-premise as well. We're founded in 2012. We're in stealth mode for 5 years. We're based in Silicon Valley. The crown jewels of what we do is, among many things, is GSQL, graph structured query language. It enables graph algorithms, and it's the best home for AI and ML. And so we answer the best questions about connected data with fast, deep, and wide insights. We have some great supply chain, healthcare customers, and we're really excited about how we work with all of you as well. Click. So in terms of use cases, we have source and material management, capacity planning, flow. Then we also have solutions that are on-prem and in the cloud with complex visualization. Geospatial is obviously vitally important for supply chain, how to do dynamic routing, telematics. And then finally, we can do the machine learning analytics side. We can do patterns, what-if planning, predictive and analytic scoring and risk, and that enables better decisions and better business outcomes. So we span this range of need in a very, very powerful, comprehensive way. Click. So here's a logical block diagram of how we connect from data sources on the left to consumption endpoints on the right. And we work closely with Expero on the toolkit and all the things we do there. Click. And Chris and Brian are going to talk about that in greater detail as we start to go deeper on this. So why is it necessary now? There are risks and rewards. We need to do more with less. We need to a do nothing approach will never help in this context, in our current moment. We need to cut costs, drive revenue, protect money as well, reduce risk overall. And the disruption and the lack of visibility that have been exposed during the pandemic is creating immense pressure. The reward for doing something now is that we're going to be able to deploy in weeks and deliver value faster than anything ever we've seen. We can evolve your current context based on SAP or Oracle to be able to augment with much higher accuracy, much better insights, and much better analytics overall. Click. So now I'm going to hand this over to Brian, and Brian's going to talk about serialization and traceability in greater detail.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
So we'll start with a quick overview of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, or the DSCSA, that was part of the Drug Quality and Security Act that was enacted in 2013. And I'll spend a few minutes in a couple minutes talking about kind of some of the overall timeline things. But before we do that, I see that there's kind of two main objectives of what was enacted. And one is to implement an interoperable and electronic tracing of products down at the package level by 2023 ultimately. And that's really the part that we're going to be more focused on. But there's also, another objective, which is around establishing national standards for the licensure of for wholesale distribution and third-party logistics. But again, we'll stay in that first objective in today's conversation. I think the underlying driver was to enhance the FDA's ability to help protect consumers, especially from exposure to drugs that may be counterfeit or stolen, contaminated, or otherwise harmful, and just generally to improve the detection and removal of potentially dangerous drugs. So I think this is kind of at the root of what there is. And if we just real quick, we'll touch on the products. If we move into the next slide, we'll see that what this is intended to cover are prescription drugs, and these are the finished dosage form of those drugs. There's a whole slew of things that it doesn't include, but this is intended to be those drugs that are to be administered to patients in their final sort of product. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see there are a few major provisions of what needs to get done for these prescription drugs, and they include three things that again we'll mostly be focused on today. One of those is product tracing. So that's the exchange of information about a drug and who handled it each time it's sold in the United States. And then that product tracing information includes three parts. One of them is transaction information, one of them is transaction history, and then one of them are the actual transaction statements for record keeping. The second item here that we'll talk a little about is product verification. So that includes the underlying record keeping, and then the support for verification request and response. So it enables us to identify and handle both suspect and illegitimate products, and it has a process for handling those. And then the other key element here is really the product identification. So that's the pieces of information like the national drug code, the serial number, the lot number, and the expiration date, and some of the labeling mandates that came through here. So those are the major provisions. As we move into the next one, we'll see from the FDA kind of the folks that are involved. Obviously, there's the actual manufacturers, there's the repackagers, and then there's the chain from there, right? The wholesalers, the dispensers, and then the third-party logistics folks that support all that activity. Those are the major groups of people that were really involved in this process. So let's take a second and we'll talk about that timeline. Like I said, it was in 2013 that the Drug Quality and Security Act came out, and then the first set of milestones were really, there was a set in 2014, but most of the actual penalties got pushed out to 2015 associated with the packaging. So this is when we started to have to put the lot numbers. The manufacturers and the repackagers, they started to have to include the lot numbers. We then had a few years to get to getting down to the serial number level, and also including the expiration dates. And now we have the added constraint starting in 2018 at the manufacturing and repackager level of tracking the transactional information, that information history and statements, and those things need to be maintained for 6 years, right? So this is how, back in the past, we started recording this data so that by the time we get to 2023, we'll start to have that history that we need for the whole chain. And then in 2019, we added the wholesalers into that list. So now they're having to capture and track this information. And then just last year, the dispensers started to have to do it as well. And there's still a lot of the system that needs to be tied together, though, as these various folks are producing and tracking this information. The ultimate goal here is still a couple of years out as we get toward the end of 2023, where we're really talking about that entire path of unit level traceability is actually accessible and available to folks who want to understand where any given prescription drug has come from. So what we hear from folks is that once compliant, there are new capabilities that could be exploited as a result. And I think the interesting thing here is that if we comply, we're not necessarily going to simply get these advantages, right? We really need to add new capability to take advantage of this data that we're generating, right? As any one in this chain. But it's still actually some additional work to tick and tie all this stuff together and make sense out of it, right? And if we do go through some of this additional work, then the things that we can ultimately realize are a complete view, excuse me, of the product's history and the chain of custody, which then continues to yield other things. Right now we have visibility from the material origin to the product delivery, and ultimately allowing us better inventory management, as we really do know exactly how things are traveling through this relatively complicated process and where they stand when, right? So it helps us understand the timing and be better at inventory management. It also helps us with the return and rebate processing, right? Because we have serial number level information about these products that are in distribution. And then to that same, that same sort of capability around the recalls, right? So as we get and need to make recalls, we know exactly where these things have gone to, and we're able to pull them off the shelves more quickly. In order to realize any of these advantages, though, there are still some challenges that are hanging out there for us to have to navigate through. So these challenges, as we'll see on the next slide, are I think there's kind of three major categories of them that we hear about. It's the data management, the integration of the data, and then the fact that we're dealing with really complex relationships that we have to navigate through in order to gain any visibility at all. So as we take a look at the data management, what we'll see are a few things on the next slide with, the transactional data here that most of us are talking about is quite large. And then you add the history of that data on top of it. So you're dealing with something that when you're trying to create visibility, you have to be able to navigate this huge pool of data. And then where is that data? Can we pull it into centralized repositories? Well, we could, but that can be expensive. Can we manage it through the decentralized locations that they're in? Again, we could, but it's hard to scale that. As we dig down into the technology that we need to support this, we have all this data that we need to write out there very, very quickly as we're producing product, or as we're transporting it or moving it forward to the next the next spot in the process. So then being able to take that data and do real-time analytics on it is also hard, right? So we have this need to write it out quickly, but then we also have this need to access it quickly as well. On the integration side of things, this data exists in lots of different systems. It exists in different systems in our own environments, because we have lots of customers that have multiple instances of a given ERP, and then through M&A they have a number of sets of different ERPs, and then they have different applications within those ERPs that host different parts of this data. So connecting all that data and integrating all that data is challenging. And then connecting the new set of systems that we've put in place to support these constraints to our existing systems is also a challenge. So there's lots of different integration to go through. And then from a relationship standpoint, we have the material side of the relationships. We have the bills of materials and the raw materials, ingredients, the intermediates, finished goods, active ingredients. And then we have the actor side of the relationships, so the suppliers and manufacturers, repackagers, wholesalers, down to the consumers. And then these are all connected in various ways. And then on top of that, we have this whole layer of time and the locations as they move around. And so there are lots of relationships to navigate. And if we can navigate all of them and intersect all of them, then we have a much better picture of what's going on in our supply chains. And so doing that effectively is what helps us kind of realize some of those advantages we talk about. So before I hand it over to Chris to show us some things, Chris is going to show us some demo and some art of the possible. And what he's going to use to do that is the power of the underlying TigerGraph graph database with a highly configurable visualization toolkit that we've built here at Expero. And we use it for a couple different business solutions. And obviously in today's case, we're really going to be focused in around the supply chain use of that toolkit. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chris and allow him to kind of to give us a sneak peek and a preview here.
Thanks, Brian. So today we'll walk through a few examples. What I'll demo first is, or potentially second, is a set of tools that show a planning workflow through a manufacturing process. And we can highlight what Michael and Brian mentioned around actually manifesting this highly connected data and this information around inventory and capacity from the perspective of a planner. So it's not enough to gain insight at a high level, but we actually have to show it at an operational and planning level to be able to affect the actual manufacturing process of the supply chain. So we'll spend a little time looking at that. We'll also show the high level, and I may actually start with the high level just for context, and see how we can bubble up information across the supply chain and get aggregate information around supply chain health after we stitch together a lot of that disparate data that may be bottled up in legacy systems, unified in a TigerGraph, and then we're able to run analytics to basically gain insight and visibility over that. And then I'll show the inventory side of it. So this again will be operational or planning workflow, but we'll see what happens when a non-compliant part is actually detected, and we'll need to either remove it or swap it, and what the upstream downstream effects of such a move would make. Now that we've got a lot of that data integrated, we can start to see how that echoes throughout the chain in the manufacturing process, distribution process, and supplier network. So those are the 3 points that we'll dig into today via demo. And without any further ado, I will jump in. So we'll go to the high level first. And when you're looking at strategic planning or long time horizons, as pharmaceuticals tend to necessitate, we can gain some, high-level product information. But what we really want to see projected into the future, and in this case, we're looking at a timeline, a time horizon projected into the future here. This would be your typical S&OP planning process. What we really want to do is assess risk. We want to sense demand and then figure out what the risk, operational risk is to be able to meet that demand, and then also how reliable that forecast is. So we can actually look at what the distributed calculated forecasting risk is. And there is supplier information and compliance information, some of which the issues that Brian outlined would fall into these categories, as well as other disruption and inventory shortage. But we can basically use this composite risk score and we can attenuate it. So if we really want to look at compliance, we could weight that higher than other sets of risks. And we could even turn off some of these things. And now our risk is attenuated with our thresholds being much higher for compliance. And now that's going to color everything that we see from an analytics standpoint. We can do this, as Michael mentioned, because we've stitched together a lot of that disparate data into, really its natural state, which is a connected set of logistic points and bill of material manifests and everything else. And now we can go through and look at various high-level scorecards from a strategy standpoint, a demand standpoint. We can look at our supplier metrics and operational alignment, for example, some forecasting information. So if we want to look at forecasted sales versus demands, and then even base some recommendations on it. We can even look at higher level KPIs around what our SLA risk is projected in, what our projected inventory imbalances are, as well as resources, and as well as what we're leaving on the table by not meeting some demand, all attenuated by that compliance risk. Included in that could be information that we've now connected together through serialization and a contiguous look through basically sourcing through the manufacturing process all the way to distribution. And we can see that change over time. So if we want to take a specific bill of materials, now we're looking at different product lines here. We can click into a product line, look at its constituent part bill of materials, and now we can see that risk coefficient as it changes through time. So what are the risks of our bill of material? Here we've got the finished good here, its constituent parts, and then it's basically combinations to larger formulations all the way up to the finished good here. So we can gain product level insight. We can look at higher aggregations across product families, but now it's decorated with the information we have specifically around compliance. If we want to take a slightly lower level, we can start with that same list of products, and we can see what their overall flow health is. So we look at the demand and the production deltas, again, through a time horizon. And we may be looking at things that are prospective in the future if we're looking at planning. And now that same risk that we're looking at, low health versus high, can again be something that we take into account around what the what the potential risk level is for individual parts that may have that may be out of compliance. And we can see that over time. And when we find a hot spot, we can in fact look at those materials and see where it is within the supply chain, and then we can take remediation actions. This again is based on a bill of materials. So this is mass data. It's not completely relevant to what we're talking about here, but what we're basically looking at here is a finished good, its sub-constituent parts, and then all the way down to the basically the raw material level. And we can take certain pieces of this. So if we know we have a problem in a certain component within the larger bill of materials, we can look at that exactly and see where the risk is between the locations. This diagram that we're looking at here is a representation of the manufacturing process. So a planner would be looking at this. They're looking at the active ingredient sourcing, the formulation step, the packaging, and then the distribution. These are the facilities that are basically within that phase of the production or supply chain process. And the line indicates basically the flow of material from one location to another within a given step or through different phases of that of the supply chain. The color is our calculated score. So this could be you know, we could have risk to this pathway here because of some calculated set of compliance issues or inventory flow issues because a part is not available because of compliance issues or what have you. The thickness of the line is that the actual volume of the flow material. So we can start to gain visibility into that, how material may flow through. And if we have a problem component, we could zero in on it from here. From a planning perspective, you want to know how that affects the overall delivery of that finished good. So what you could potentially do in a tool like this is then run a mitigation strategy if you've got an issue. In this case, I'm going to look at compliance, and then we'll look at inventory in a second. But I've got here a scenario that I'm going to build now around utilization. And so I've got my my overall utilization for that specific factory that I clicked on in the other screen. And I can see here month over month if it's overutilized or underutilized, or it's right within the zone that I want it to be in, which is in this case 85 to 95% utilized. And so from here, because we can calculate the overall risk of the overall chain, we can ask the system basically to help us rebalance this. And I'm gonna analyze it. It's gonna give me some recommendations to move material around within a set of heuristics, a set of calculations. I think Victor may go into this a little bit in a little bit more detail, but we mentioned it earlier in the webinar, where now that this data is connected together, you have that analytics power where you can start to say, okay, well, how within these sets of heuristics, how can I move this material around, and how will it affect the basically the overall network of the supply chain, both upstream and downstream. So I'm going to select all of these recommendations that the system has given me. I'm going to apply them, and you'll see that it starts to move things. It tries to remediate the situation, and I can compare how this started, the baseline, versus what the scenario that I built using the recommendations are, and I can start to see how that is influenced. And so this is just another example of once the network is connected, and once a risk or an issue is detected with that highly connected data, now you can start to run through that network and see how risk accumulates, and then how you can mitigate that both upstream and downstream. So a lot of those unintended consequences where you find an issue in a legacy system and you may even remediate it, but it's not connected to other systems, you don't know what the downstream effects are. This is kind of a capacity example of how once you're armed with the information around a disruption in the supply chain, you can start to mediate it. I'm going to show one more concept. This one is around inventory. So basically a non-compliant part is detected. It shows some of the same information around projected inventory and capacity, but in this case, we've got a few products that are flagged with some kind of risk around compliance. So I see what my finished goods are here. I'm going to choose this GPS system in this case. Here I see a high level view of the bill of materials. It looks very familiar to some of the other screens that we looked at, but I see that I have an issue here, a flagged component basically out of compliance. So I'm going to click on it, look at it. look what the projected inventory is over time. So I've got some shortage here and I've got some surplus, but overall it looks like there's actually an issue with some of the availability of this product. I've got that aggregate risk score that we were looking at before. This has to do with sourcing, environmental issues, contracts. So you can see more supplier-based components of that risk score in this case. It also tells me what alternative units may be. So I could potentially swap this component for other ones. In this case, this is consumer electronics. So, so these components are a little bit more, we have the ability to potentially swap them a little bit easier. So I can add this component now to a watch list and just basically flag it throughout the system. And as things come up, I can see that. I can find other components like this or other products that hold this component. Or I can go ahead and build another scenario, just like we did with the capacity. I'm going to build this for inventory. So I've got my bill of material. I've got my representation of the flow through the manufacturing process from source here to actual distribution and end customer. And then the manufacturing process itself lies in the middle here. So I'm going to see what would happen if I actually removed that product from this altogether. And bad things will happen. So I can see what that flow looks like. And sure enough, if I remove that, I'm going to start to immediately have shortages right after that point in the supply chain. And so I can also see here that there are points where I've got inventory coverage issues almost immediately once I remove the part. So I can then go ahead and look at that from a resourcing issue, same kind of view, but through resourcing. So these are resources within. It's the same kind of view that we looked at where we've got factories here and then we've got resource issues. And sure enough, there are issues here. If I replace the part, I can potentially remediate it though. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then look and see what happens. And it remediates it as soon as I add another OEM resource. The next thing I want to see is what that may look like from where that part sits in the continuum of my supply chain. So this is where that contiguous, serialized unbroken chain of custody comes into play. I've got this broken up in this case by regions, and then I've got each of my products here, and then that part that's in each of those products, I can see if it's already been delivered, and this is per 1,000 parts. So I've got a lot of parts in Asia out in the wild here that have already been delivered to customers with that problem part. Some of them are in distribution. None of them are currently in the manufacturing process, but you can see that changes in different zones. So this is only possible if you connect all of that data, and then you can start to project out, and you can see where, not only how does this gum up my manufacturing process because I have to pull this part or swap it out or wait until that happens, but what are the issues that are downstream that are already out in the wild, how that part that already got out, and run a mitigation strategy from that standpoint. And then also look backwards and see from a sourcing perspective, where did that part come from, and how do you remediate that? Yeah, so that's those are three quick examples of once the data is actually consolidated, what kind of analytic solutions can we build on top of it? Okay, next I'm going to hand it over to Victor, and he's going to talk a little bit about building a better supply chain.
Great, thank you, Chris. That was a great demo. I'm always so impressed by the visual impact. I understand at an abstract sense what you can do with a graph database, but to see it realized into use cases is great. So if you go on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about planning your success for your graph solution. If you are considering or already decided that a graph solution may be the way to go to handle your supply chain, we want you to be successful. So I'm going to try to highlight some considerations. You want to identify your current needs. Sorry about that. Anticipate your future needs and scale. Understand differences among the different options you have for graph platforms, and consider graph-based machine learning, as Michael mentioned. So on the next slide, we're talking about supply chain in general today, and pharma supply chain in particular. But you think obviously a supply chain is a graph. Well, sure, and there are supply chain products out there already. Do I need something more? I want you to realize that the issues that particularly Michael and Brian brought up today, it is more. You want more than just to model the supply chain itself. You have the compliance issues, you have the risk issues. You want to model for each layer, as I show. If you look just at the drug itself, you have all the aspects about the drug. It's what is its indications. There are the characteristics of the drug itself, who manufactures it. When you get to the manufacturers, along with the drugs, you also have what are the alternatives. Manufacturers have their own information. The distributors have their information, and the dispensaries, the final destination where the consumer gets it. Each layer has its own set of information. You model the production process, you model the distribution process. As we talked about, the need to track individual lots. So the lots themselves become entities, and you can watch them moving through the system. How do you model regulations? You model them perhaps as a constraint on a particular node or edge, but so it's something in words, right? Do you translate that into a rule for how things move across the system and what information you're collecting as it moves? Those are really interesting questions. We have ideas about how you do that. And of course, then there's the business side. How do you model the pricing and the dynamics of that, the fact that it can change? And so it's more than just the supply chain itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So in the next slide, kind of go into the 3 areas that we talk about at TigerGraph for thinking about a graph for advanced analytics and machine learning. You have 3 aspects: connect, analyze, and learn. So if you click once, get the little graphic. So first, you're pulling your data together, in this case, into a supply chain. As I did mention, you have all these considerations. You're pulling data from multiple sources, but it's very easy to show how they're related. It's very visual and very natural for the computer if you have a graph database, and natural for the human users of the system to keep adding different dimensions and different layers to the information. So it's all connected. Second, one more click, we analyze, and now you put your connected database to work. You set up your standard monitoring. So you have your standard dashboard. It just gives you regular reports, alerts as if something goes out of the norm. You can calculate the schedules and the costs, but then you start to dig into the data, and it's really about understanding the processes, maybe discovering bottlenecks and weak spots. Everything has to go through this one chain, this one link in the chain that represents possibly both a slowdown and a risk if something goes wrong with that. So you want to identify that. And there's also running those what if scenarios that Chris brought up. What if one distribution link becomes unavailable? What if there's something in the raw materials that becomes unavailable or delayed? Pricing changes. In the case of pharma, you have things such as, of course, when does a new drug come on the market as for approval? You have the insurance companies changing their formularies for what is the approved drug that's considered, covered by the insurances versus the ones that are not? Are generics coming online? You have all those considerations. The possibility of a recall, maybe not likely. Hope that doesn't happen, but that could happen. And then if you are, on the business side, you're trying to optimize cost. What is the most cost-effective way? If you are on the as we are right now with COVID-19, trying to make sure that everybody gets the vaccine. You're looking at global distribution. What's the best way to get uh, the most vaccine out to as many people as possible, as quickly as possible? Cost is a factor, but not the top factor. Speed is the factor. And finally, you apply even more advanced analytics, basically machine learning, to say, how can I, and that's where the optimization comes in. You do basic optimization. You can manually consider different situations. Learning is when you have the system tell you, this is the best way, gets you the lowest cost, this gets you the most rapid distribution, this has the lowest risk, etc. So having this highly performant graph, flexible graph, having all the data together and the correct analytics tied to it will enable you to do all of these things. Next slide. So let's talk about now addressing those needs. You kind of figured out what you want to do. You're going to need a scalable system because you are bringing a lot of data together. It's going to be larger in one single database than you maybe previously had. At least more data in an operational database. You may have it in your data lake, but now we're going to make it an operational database. So you want to make sure that you select a graph solution that is scalable in size and scalable in performance. So parallel processing in particular is important. Secondly, next slide, it is that how fast can you do the requisite operations? And again, we talked about doing bulk loading, as well as stream loading, and the analytics. Now, some of the simple queries will be very local. You ask a question that's just looking at one node and a couple of its very local neighborhoods. That's easy. If you want to ask a question of the whole supply chain, if you're trying to analyze, if you're trying to optimize, then you need to be able to look through all or most of the supply chain into those different layers. Again, not just the sort of one-dimensional or two-dimensional supply chain itself from beginning to end, but looking at the side issues of the cost and the regulation and the risk. So there you need something, again, that's scalable in performance. You want a native graph that is designed to be a graph database originally to get all the benefits of graph link following, link hopping. And you need that real-time update and real-time deep link queryability. So that's a second, scaling in size, scaling in performance, and doing the things that graphs are supposed to be good at, a native graph and, deep link queries. On the next slide, again, is it suitable for analytics and machine learning? And this is maybe either getting to your more advanced or your future needs, but you want to plan for the future. And we would suggest these are things that you should be considering now. Does it support graph algorithms? And does it support machine learning? So TigerGraph, for example, comes with a library of graph algorithms, but they're just written in our query language, so they're open source. You can see and modify them. You can, tune them, customize them for your own needs. If you have slightly different considerations you want for your graph algorithm, and once you become a little bit more proficient, you could write your own. You could, work with a consultant to write another one. So it's not closed like some of the other graph solutions where you only get what they have and there's no way to add to it. Because our query language is designed for analytics, designed for this sort of algorithmic processing. it just works very naturally. And again, we also have several new machine learning algorithms. We have support for, Python integration and Python-based notebooks. So that's another avenue that's open to you. So again, not all graph databases, particularly some of if you're thinking, I have a knowledge graph, I have an RDF graph, is that appropriate? Well, it might be good for modeling the data, but once you try to do the workload, it might not be appropriate. So that's the last consideration I have, sort of those three: scalability, real-time analytical performance, and suitability for those sort of analytics and machine learning. Next slide. This is just, an overview of some of the graph algorithms that are typically available. On the left column are just very traditional graph algorithms, which you might have studied in school if you're a computer science student. And on the right, these are some of the new machine learning based techniques, which some have been around for a little while. The paper on graph convolutional networks came out just in 2017. It's very new. But the industry is moving fast. So these are quickly being adopted for people who have graph and are doing machine learning. Next slide. Another advantage of using graph is that it's a very explainable model. When you look at those dashboards, it's not necessary to be looking at the graph all the time. The best display of information may be some sort of line chart or Sankey chart. But when you have a machine learning AI system, and one of the issues with some of the methods today, particularly deep learning, it is very opaque. It doesn't give you a good understanding of why it made the decision. The difference with graph, some of the graph machine learning techniques fall into that camp, but a lot of them, because you can look at the relationships have semantic meaning, and they will tell you directly why something is happening. And so having a machine learning model which uses graph features, which are very semantic features, and makes decisions based on the presence or the weight of different graph features, is going to be very explainable. And that's something that will help regulators. It will help your decision makers, everyone feel comfortable that your system is in fact doing the right thing. And wrapping up, so we even have a scheme for in-database machine learning, where again, you connect, you build your data, your supply chain 360 graph, you run some algorithms to enrich the data even more, to decorate the data, so to speak, with additional features about what is characteristic about, what is special about this drug based on its situation in the network, or this manufacturer. So those become extra features. Then you can apply whatever graph neural network or graph embedding to train your network, and now you have a model for predicting or analyzing, optimizing how things perform, and then you can deploy it to do your real-time prediction, real-time supply chain management. So wrapping up on my last slide, this are just some of the things where we feel that TigerGraph and the combination of TigerGraph Expero really delivers the things that we said you should be looking for, that real-time deep link querying, so that you can explore the full multi-layered supply chain. Scalability, because you will be bringing more data in, and that in-database analytics and machine learning, so that you can get the most benefit, the most intelligence out of your data. And with those dashboards, with some features in TigerGraph, you can be building no-code solutions, so writing queries without coding, and importing your data from those other external sources with no code. And so thank you for your time. All of us here, Michael, Brian, Chris, and myself, would like to thank you for your attention. You can try TigerGraph out for free on tigergraph.com/cloud. And we are here to answer your questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for the presentations today. We did have a few questions that came through, so I'll go ahead and start with those. Just a reminder for everyone on the webinar today, if you do have any questions while we're going through Q&A, you can just drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So just to kick this off, which systems do these replace, and can they take feeds from ERP and other sources?
I'll take that one, Laura. This is Chris. Or at least I'll take half of it. So the solutions that I demoed today, and a lot of the solutions that we work together with TigerGraph to bring to fruition, are meant to live with coexist, if you will, with those other systems within supply chain, because some of those ERP systems are so integral to the way that a lot of constituents throughout the process interact with data and get things done from an operational standpoint. Our systems work more in concert with those, and therefore, even if the ERP is the system of record, we can leverage that to gain insight through the sets of solutions that we walk through today. So the answer is it can work together in concert with those things. They could also be standalone solutions as well if a customer doesn't have a full suite of ERP systems or other systems in place.
I think we would just echo that to say that is true. We could be bringing something new. It can be complementary and enhancement to what you already have. If you already currently have a pretty basic supply chain management tool, you might want to consider replacement, but it doesn't have to be. It can be complementary.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. The next one, what does a typical engagement look like? How long has it taken for customers to see value?
Yeah, would somebody on the Expero side want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. This is Brian. I can jump in. It's fairly often that we start with something like a pilot, where we pick a very specific value proposition and area, with the whole goal to deliver value very quickly. That time period varies a little bit, but generally we're talking about something that's in the 6 to 12 week time period, where we have a functioning application up and running, and kind of proving the value proposition so that the organizations can have buy-in to where we're headed and prove out that it's the right path for them.
I'd like to point out that on TigerGraph Cloud, we have some supply chain starter kits where you can play around, not with this particular dashboard, but just TigerGraph itself. But we also do have available through our joint efforts a supply chain toolkit, which we can make available to you. So again, there's something that has been pre-built as a reference, that where you can understand what this could do for you very quickly.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian and Victor. The next one that came through, how configurable is the dashboard for changing needs, such as new regulations?
This is Chris again. I can take a shot at that. The sets of dashboards that we looked at today were based on the toolkit that's already been mentioned. That toolkit has a set of widgets, a set of components that allow it to be highly configurable and highly flexible. So the dashboards themselves can be basically tailored to fit almost any use case that requires a data analytics platform to gain insight.
Thank you, Chris. We had a few more here. Is a knowledge graph or a property graph better for supply chain use cases?
Yeah, I think I touched on that briefly. So I'll reiterate and try to expand. So a knowledge graph or RDF graph is, one form based on triples. It has advantages of some sort of universal or open world nature, but it's really designed for what it says. It's for representing facts and knowledge. It can do some reasoning, but that is not so much the use case we talked about here. A property graph can represent the information that you have here as well, arguably better, but I think it's the workload difference that is really the difference. We're not trying to do logical inference. We're trying to do more computational work. And so I think in that sense, that is why property graphs are designed to really model the data the way you want and to do analytics more performantly. So that's why we would suggest that that's probably the better choice for the supply chain analytics and management that we've talked about here.
Okay, well, it looks like that was all of the questions. So just as a reminder, we were recording the session and I will send out an email with the recording this week. If you have any questions that weren't addressed here, feel free to reply to that email and we can get a call set up with one of our team members. Thank you all again so much for joining today. Thank you to all of our panelists from both Expero and TigerGraph. We look forward to the next one.